Rain lashed against the pavement like 1,000 furious whips, each droplet a tiny explosion of cold against the scorching summer asphalt. The sky over Manhattan had turned the color of a fresh bruise, purple-black and swollen with fury, and the gutters had become rushing rivers carrying the detritus of the city toward the hungry maw of the East River. Ethan Vasquez tightened his grip on the strap of his battered carbon fiber cello case, his knuckles bleaching white beneath the olive tone of his skin. The weight of the instrument, his only inheritance, his only constant companion, anchored him against the surging tide of bodies pushing past him on Lexington Avenue. Yellow cabs screamed their outrage at pedestrians who dared to cross against the light, and somewhere a jackhammer was having an argument with the concrete it was devouring. To be blind in New York City was to navigate a living nightmare blindfolded. To do it during a flash flood was to court death itself. Ethan was 18 years old, and he had been blind for 6 of those years. The world had become an ocean of sound and texture, of shifting air pressure and the subtle dance of heat against his skin. His white carbon fiber cane, a state-of-the-art model his late mother had saved for years to buy, swept left and right in rhythmic, practiced arcs, reading the pavement like a musician reads sheet music. But the rising water was winning. The rain was so dense now that even the sounds were drowning. The familiar echo of buildings, the bounce of sound off storefronts that usually helped him triangulate his position, all of it was being swallowed by the relentless drumming of the storm. His designer sneakers, a gift from a scholarship sponsor he'd never met, were soaked through, and the water was beginning to lap at his ankles. Desperation clawed at his throat. He needed shelter. He needed it immediately. Through the roar of the storm, his ears caught something, a distinct, muffled hush. Heavy revolving doors, the kind that moved with the ponderous weight of old money and older secrets. And beneath that, the faint, elegant strain of a string quartet playing something by Vivaldi. The winter movement, if he wasn't mistaken. Ironic, given the weather. A hotel. Has to be. The Waldorf? No, different acoustics. The St. Regis. Yes. He'd been here once years ago, when his mother was still alive and the world still had color. Guided by the warmth radiating from the building's massive facade and the subtle scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, that particular smell of wealth that no amount of money could quite replicate unless you had generational money, Ethan pushed his way through the heavy brass doors. The immediate silence of the grand foyer washed over him like a wave of blessed relief. The storm's fury was reduced to a muffled growl, the chaos of the city suddenly a world away. His chest heaved as he shook the rain from his dark, curly hair that fell in damp ringlets across his forehead, droplets tracing paths down his high cheekbones and the sharp line of his jaw. He paused, orienting himself in the vast, echoing space. The marble beneath his feet was slick, polished to a mirror shine that he could feel in the quality of the echo. To his left, the faint clink of crystal and the murmur of conversation. To his right, the rustle of expensive fabrics and the soft pad of concierge shoes on carpet. He didn't know that he had just walked into the epicenter of a war. Less than 50 feet away, Nikolai Volkov was descending the grand staircase. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned not just the building, but the very lives of everyone inside it. Clad in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that clung flawlessly to his broad shoulders that could carry the weight of an empire and the secrets of 1,000 dead men, Nikolai was the undisputed head of the Volkov Syndicate, the most feared organization on the eastern seaboard. He was 31 years old, and he had been running the family since he was 23, when his father had been gunned down in a Moscow alley by men who had once called him brother. Nikolai had watched the footage 17 times, the way his father's body had crumpled, the way the blood had spread across the snow like a terrible flower, and then he had systematically dismantled every single person involved. Their families had been left with nothing. Their names had been erased from every record, every memory. Nikolai Volkov did not forget, and he did not forgive. A heavy platinum Rolex Daytona peeked from beneath his French cuffs, a cold testament to his immense inherited wealth. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed men, led by his ruthless underboss Sergei. They had just concluded a brutal negotiation in a private suite upstairs. A rogue faction from the Petrov family had attempted to siphon funds from the Volkovs' offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Nikolai had dealt with the traitor personally, leaving a broken, bleeding man on the Persian rug of the penthouse. The man had wept, begged, promised his firstborn, his soul, his mother's grave. Nikolai had listened with the patient attention of a man who has all the time in the world, and then he had broken the traitor's fingers, one by one, to the rhythm of the man's own sobs. Nikolai's adrenaline was still running high. His dark, calculating eyes, the color of winter storms over the Baltic Sea, scanned the lobby for threats. He was a man who trusted no one and forgave nothing. "Bring the armored convoy to the front," Nikolai ordered Sergei, his voice the low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute obedience. He spoke with the accent of old money St. Petersburg, the vowels clipped and precise, the consonants sharp as broken glass. "And have the Petrov warehouses in Brooklyn burned to the ground before midnight. Leave no witnesses. Consider it done, boss," Sergei replied, reaching for his earpiece. Nikolai took another step toward the exit, his mind already shifting to the logistics of a full-scale mafia war, the bodies that would need to be disposed of, the politicians who would need to be paid off, the accounts that would need to be laundered through the real estate holdings in Dubai. And then it happened. Ethan, disoriented by the sudden shift in acoustics and the lingering panic from the storm, took a hurried step forward to find the concierge desk. His wet heel caught the edge of a slick marble tile. He lost his balance. The heavy cello case, a beloved weight he had carried since he was 12, threw him violently off-center. He pitched forward, his hands flying out to brace for a painful impact with the floor. Instead, he slammed into a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. His white cane clattered loudly against the pristine marble, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in a cavernous lobby. His cello case hit the ground with a sickening thud, and for a moment his entire world was nothing but panic and the overpowering scent of someone who smelled like wealth and winter rain and something darker beneath it, something metallic, something like blood. In a fraction of a second, the atmosphere in the St. Regis shifted from luxurious tranquility to lethal tension. Clack, clack, clack. The unmistakable, terrifying sound of 6 Glock 19s being drawn and racked filled the air. Sergei and the bodyguards instantly formed a tactical semicircle around their don, their weapons trained directly on the soaking wet boy who had dared to breach Nikolai Volkov's personal space. "Step back," Sergei barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. His voice was thick with a Russian accent that promised violence and meant every syllable. Ethan froze, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He couldn't see the guns, but he could smell the sudden metallic tang of gun oil, the sharp scent of aggressive aftershave, something cheap and brutal, the kind of scent worn by men who didn't expect to live past 40. He could hear the rustle of tailored suits, the heavy, synchronized breathing of men ready to kill. Terror paralyzed him. He was trapped against the chest of a man who felt like a statue carved from granite, all hard planes and unyielding angles, radiating a cold fury that made the storm outside feel like a summer breeze. Nikolai had reacted entirely on instinct. When the figure tumbled toward him, his combat reflexes had flared. His hand had already been reaching for the Sig Sauer P226 concealed beneath his jacket. But as his large, calloused hands gripped the boy's shoulders to shove him away, he looked down, and time seemed to fracture and grind to an absolute halt. He saw the dark, curly hair plastered to the boy's pale cheeks, the water droplets clinging to his lashes like tiny diamonds. He saw the panicked, sightless hazel eyes that were the color of autumn leaves and forest streams and everything good in a world that had forgotten how to be good, staring blankly at his collarbone. And then his gaze locked onto the delicate, crescent-shaped scar resting just beneath the boy's right jawline. A scar he had paid the world's best plastic surgeons to minimize. 12 years ago. Nikolai's breath hitched in his throat. The cold, calculating Mafia Don, who had just ordered the deaths of dozens of men without blinking, suddenly looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His grip on the boy's shoulders softened, shifting from defensive aggression to a desperate, possessive hold that bordered on reverent. "Boss?" Sergei asked, confusion lacing his aggressive tone. "Give the word." Nikolai didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the terrified patrons cowering behind the lobby pillars, their champagne glasses trembling in their hands. His eyes were entirely consumed by the trembling boy in his arms, the boy he had spent a decade watching from the shadows, the boy he had promised to protect at all costs, the boy whose existence had become the single thread of humanity in a life that had long since drowned in blood and guilt. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the boy's ear, that delicate shell of cartilage and skin, pink with cold and fear, and whispered a single terrifying word that sent a shockwave through the room. "Mine." The word wasn't a claim of property. It was a desperate vow, laced with 12 years of hidden guilt and an obsession that defied all logic. It was the sound of a man who had been drowning in darkness, suddenly finding a single point of light and refusing to let it go. The absolute silence that followed Nikolai's whisper was deafening. Ethan trembled. His heightened senses, honed by 6 years of blindness, 6 years of learning to read the world through sound and texture, and the subtle shift of air, were rapidly processing the overwhelming stimuli. The man holding him smelled of rich Tom Ford wood, a scent that was all smoke and leather, and the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. But beneath that, beneath the carefully curated luxury, there was something else. The faint, underlying metallic scent of fresh blood. The sharp tang of adrenaline. And something warmer, something that made no sense in this context. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of vanilla and something floral, like the ghost of a memory. Jasmine. His mother used to wear jasmine. "Put the guns away," Nikolai commanded. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal authority that brooked zero hesitation. It was the voice of a man who had never had to repeat an order in his adult life. "Nikolai, we don't know who," Sergei started. "I said put them away." Nikolai snarled, shooting his underboss a glare so venomous it made the seasoned killer take a physical step back. Sergei's face went pale beneath his stubble, and for the first time in his 15 years of service, he looked genuinely afraid. The sound of weapons being holstered rippled through the lobby like a sigh of relief. Ethan finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I couldn't see. I slipped. Please just let me get my cane." He tried to pull away, but Nikolai's hands remained firmly, yet gently, planted on his arms. The grip was undeniable. The man was holding him like he was something precious, something that might shatter if released. "You're not going back out there," Nikolai said softly, his tone completely shifting from the monster he had been seconds prior. The gravel was still there, the accent, but there was something else beneath it now. Tenderness. Fear. He reached down effortlessly, retrieving Ethan's fallen white cane and pressing it gently into his trembling hand. His fingers lingered against Ethan's, warm and calloused, and Ethan felt something electric shoot up his arm, something that made no sense, something that had no place in a moment of terror. "Sergei," Nikolai said, still not releasing Ethan's hand. "Take the cello. Carefully. It's a late 18th century tester. If you scratch it, I will take your hand." Ethan gasped. "How could you possibly know?" He didn't finish the question because the answer was too terrifying to contemplate. How could a complete stranger know the exact make and era of his prized instrument? Before he could protest further, Nikolai draped his heavy, dry cashmere overcoat around Ethan's shivering shoulders. The coat was enormous on him. It had to be, given the difference in their frames, and it smelled like Nikolai. That impossible combination of smoke and leather and jasmine, and something underneath it that Ethan's brain couldn't quite categorize. Something like home, in a way he'd never felt before. "Walk with me, Ethan." Hearing his own name fall from this dangerous stranger's lips sent a jolt of pure ice down his spine. No, that was impossible. How could this man, this terrifying blood-soaked stranger, know his name? "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, trying to dig his heels into the marble. "How do you know my name?" But Nikolai's forward momentum was unstoppable. He was guiding Ethan through the revolving doors, surrounded by a shield of heavily armed men. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed distant, unimportant. The only thing that mattered was the grip on his arm, the warmth of the coat around his shoulders, the deep rumble of a voice that had just claimed him like property. "I'm someone who owes you a debt," Nikolai replied cryptically, as they stepped out into the storm. A massive black Mercedes Maybach S65 armored limousine was idling at the curb, its rear door already held open by a stoic driver in a black suit. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian, and the engine made barely a sound, a predatory purr that spoke of millions of dollars in engineering and even more in security. "I'm not getting in a car with you," Ethan shouted, panic finally overriding his shock. He swung his cane defensively, the carbon fiber whistling through the air. But Nikolai simply caught it mid-swing with lightning speed. "Ethan, listen to me." Nikolai's voice dropped to a desperate, intense register. "Ivan Petrov's men are currently kicking down the door of your apartment on West 74th Street. If you go home tonight, you will die. Get in the car." The sheer conviction in his voice, coupled with the terrifying mention of an invasion at his home, shattered Ethan's resistance. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He'd never had a home invasion. He'd never had anyone threaten him at all. He was just a musician, a blind orphan who played at weddings and symphonies and tried to get by in a world that had never been designed for someone like him. Numb with shock, he allowed himself to be guided into the plush, heated leather interior of the Maybach. Sergei carefully placed the cello case in the trunk before climbing into the front passenger seat. The door closed with a sound like a bank vault ceiling, heavy, final, inescapable. The armored doors cut off the noise of the storm entirely, and Ethan was left in a cocoon of silence and warmth and the overwhelming presence of the man sitting across from him. The drive was agonizingly silent. Ethan sat rigidly against the door, clutching his cane like a weapon. His other hand was wrapped around the edge of the seat, knuckles white, trying to anchor himself. He couldn't see, but he could feel Nikolai's gaze on him, burning, intense, utterly consuming. It was the kind of attention that would have made him uncomfortable, even if he could see. The kind of attention that stripped away pretense and left him feeling naked. "Drink this." Nikolai's voice cut through the silence. He pressed a heavy crystal glass into Ethan's hand. "It will stop the shivering." Ethan recognized the scent immediately. Single malt scotch, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month. He took a small, burning sip, the liquid fire grounding him. It spread through his chest like a slow-burning warmth, chasing away the chill that had settled into his bones. "Why is someone trying to kill me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I'm a cellist. I play at weddings and symphonies. I don't have enemies. I don't even have a family anymore." "You don't," Nikolai corrected, pouring himself a drink. "Your father did." Ethan's head snapped toward the sound of his voice. "My father. Mateo Hayes was a corporate actuary. He died in a car crash 12 years ago. I was there." His voice caught, the memory of that night surging up like bile. The screeching tires. The shattering glass. His father's final, choked gasp, holding his hand in the wreckage even as the blood poured from his own wounds. "I was 12. I was in the passenger seat. The glass took my sight, but he saved my life." Nikolai let out a heavy, cynical sigh. "Your father, Mateo, was a brilliant man, Ethan. But he wasn't an actuary. He was the chief financial fixer for the Volkov crime syndicate." "My syndicate?" Ethan's breath caught. "You're lying. My father was a good, boring man. He worked in a cubicle. He wore glasses that were always slipping down his nose. He worked in a secured vault deep beneath the Diamond District." Nikolai cut in, his tone devoid of malice, only heavy with a grim truth. "He laundered hundreds of millions of dollars for my father. He was a ghost in the financial system, the best we ever had. But 12 years ago, the Petrov family found out who he was. They wanted him to turn over the ledgers, the master account numbers for the Swiss and Cayman shell corporations." Nikolai leaned forward, and the scent of his cologne enveloped Ethan like a second skin. That car crash on Interstate 95 wasn't a drunk driver, Ethan. It was a Petrov hitman named Victor. Your father swerved his sedan to take the brunt of the impact so you would survive. Tears pricked Ethan's unseeing eyes as the buried trauma of that horrific night violently resurfaced. Why are you telling me this now? He sobbed, the whiskey glass shaking in his grip. Why ruin my memory of him? Because Ivan Petrov just found out that Mateo Hayes' son is still alive, Nikolai said, his voice tightening with suppressed rage. He thinks your father left the encrypted ledger with you. They were at your apartment tonight to torture it out of you. The Maybach smoothly pulled into a private, subterranean parking garage. The heavy steel gates slammed shut behind him with a definitive clang that echoed like a prison door closing. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence and the distant hum of the engine cooling. Ethan could feel the warmth of Nikolai's presence, the weight of the coat still draped over his shoulders, the phantom sensation of fingers still lingering against his hand. For 12 years, Nikolai confessed, his voice suddenly soft, vulnerable, a jarring contrast to the intimidating presence he projected. I have watched from the shadows. Ethan's mind raced as pieces of his life suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. The anonymous scholarship to Juilliard, he whispered. The checks that arrived every month, no return address. The medical bills. The experimental corneal surgeries at Johns Hopkins. All of it, funded through a shell corporation in Geneva, Nikolai confirmed. I made sure you had the best of everything. Everything except the truth. The truth. Ethan laughed bitterly, and it came out broken, hysterical. What truth? That my entire life has been a lie. That the father I loved was a criminal? That I've been watched for 12 years by you? What are you, Nikolai? My guardian angel? My stalker? Both, Nikolai admitted, and there was something raw in his voice, something that made Ethan's heart clench despite everything. I've been both, and I will continue to be both for as long as I live. Nikolai reached across the console, his large warm hand gently enveloping Ethan's trembling fingers. He didn't force the contact, allowing him to pull away if he chose to, but Ethan was too stunned to move. When my father passed, I took over the syndicate, Nikolai said, his thumb lightly tracing the knuckles of Ethan's hand. I swore on his grave that the debt we owed Mateo Hayes would be paid. I promised to keep you safe. You were never supposed to know about me, Ethan. You were supposed to live a beautiful, ordinary life in the light, far away from my darkness. The car door opened, and the cold air of the underground garage rushed in. But Nikolai didn't move. But tonight, the darkness found you, Nikolai said, stepping out and offering his hand to guide him. Welcome to 432 Park Avenue. You are standing in the most secure fortress in Manhattan. You will stay here until every last member of the Petrov family is eradicated from this earth. Ethan gripped his hand, stepping out of the car. He had stumbled into the St. Regis, seeking temporary shelter from a summer storm. Instead, he had walked directly into a golden cage, held captive by a Mafia don who had secretly orchestrated his entire existence. He didn't know if he was a prisoner or a guest. He didn't know if he should feel grateful or horrified. But as Nikolai's hand tightened around his firm, possessive, unyielding, he knew one thing for certain. He had just stumbled into a world of secrets and blood and desire, and there was no going back. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was a sensory fortress suspended a quarter of a mile above the chaotic streets of Manhattan. For 3 days, Ethan existed within a world of absolute, suffocating luxury. His bare feet learned the topography of heated Afghan silk rugs and cool imported Carrara marble. The air was perpetually climate-controlled, carrying the subtle synthesized fragrance of white tea and figure. The windows were floor-to-ceiling, a wall of reinforced glass that would have offered the most spectacular views of the city, if he'd been able to see them. Yet despite the opulent comfort, it was a high-altitude prison. Nikolai Volkov treated him with a terrifying, reverent obsession. The man barely slept. Ethan could hear the heavy, measured pacing of his handmade Beluti Oxfords on the hardwood floors late into the night, a restless rhythm that spoke of sleeplessness and something darker. something like guilt or fear or both. Nikolai fed him elaborate meals prepared by a private Michelin-starred chef, dishes that Ethan could only identify by scent and texture: seared foie gras, truffled risotto, delicate pastries that dissolved on his tongue. He provided Ethan with racks of silk loungewear and toiletries that cost more than most people's rent. And he spent hours simply sitting in the corner of the grand living room, listening to Ethan play his test or cello. It was during those hours that Ethan felt the most conflicted. Music had always been his escape, his language, his soul laid bare. When he played, he forgot about the blindness, forgot about the loneliness, forgot about the gaping hole his father's death had left in his chest. And Nikolai, this terrifying blood-soaked monster who had ordered the deaths of countless men, listened. Not just heard. Listened. Ethan could feel the intensity of Nikolai's attention, the way the man's breathing would slow when the music was especially beautiful, the way his fingers would tap against his knee in time with the rhythm. It was disconcerting, being so completely the focus of someone's gaze. It made Ethan feel seen, in a way he hadn't felt since his mother died. But beneath the surface of this gilded cage, a mafia war was boiling over. The Petrov family, desperate and cornered, was tearing the city apart looking for him. Sirens wailed endlessly from the streets below, a distant symphony of the chaos Nikolai was orchestrating to crush his enemies. On the fourth evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse shattered. Sergei burst through the double mahogany doors, his heavy breathing audible even over the box suite Ethan was playing. "Boss," Sergei's voice was tight, urgent. "Ivan Petrov just made a move on the Teterboro airstrip. They intercepted a shipment of our heavy artillery. It's a bloodbath. They have our men pinned down in Hangar 4. Ethan heard the sound of a heavy glass tumbler slamming onto a table. "Ivan is getting desperate," Nikolai snarled. "He knows we are closing the net. I need to be there to coordinate the extraction." "It's risky, Sergei. Could be a distraction. I don't have a choice, boss. If we lose that shipment, the Commission will view it as weakness." Ethan heard the metallic scrape of a magazine being loaded into a pistol, the 6-hour P226 that Nikolai kept close at all times. The sound made his stomach clench. Then Nikolai crossed the room, and Ethan felt the man's presence stop inches from where he sat with his cello. "Ethan," Nikolai said, his voice instantly softening, dropping an octave into that possessive tone that made Ethan's skin prickle. "I have to leave for a few hours. The building is on total lockdown. The elevators require biometric clearance. No one gets in or out. Are you going to be safe?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. He projected the perfect image of the terrified civilian he believed himself to be. He'd had 6 years to perfect the act. 6 years of pretending to be weaker than he was, of letting people underestimate him. "I'm always safe, Moil Lyubov," Nikolai murmured, his knuckles gently brushing Ethan's cheek. The endearment, "my love," sent a shock through Ethan's system. It was the first time Nikolai had used it, and it hit him like a blow to the chest. "I am leaving Daniel to oversee your personal detail," Nikolai continued. "He is my top captain. You have nothing to fear." The door clicked shut. The apartment fell silent. Nikolai was gone. Ethan sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the strings of his cello. The instrument was warm against his chest, a familiar weight that grounded him. He focused his hearing, mapping the room. Faint hum of the sub-zero refrigerator in the kitchen. Whistling of the wind against the floor-to-ceiling, reinforced glass. And the deliberate, heavy breathing of the man Nikolai had left behind. Daniel. Daniel was standing near the entryway. He smelled heavily of cheap tobacco, peppermint gum, and a distinct underlying odor of nervous sweat. It was the sweat of a man whose adrenaline was spiking. So Daniel's voice finally broke the silence. It lacked the respectful deference he usually displayed around Nikolai. There was a cruel, sharp edge to it. The famous Ethan Vasquez. The blind prince sitting on a ghost fortune. Ethan didn't move. "Nikolai said you were here to protect me." Daniel let out a low, humorless chuckle. Ethan heard the distinct, terrifying sound of a silencer being screwed onto the barrel of a pistol. "Nikolai is a fool," Daniel sneered, his footsteps moving slowly across the Persian rug toward Ethan. He let his obsession with you blind him to the reality of the business. You don't burn down half of New York over some blind boy. Blind boy, Ethan thought, and something cold settled in his chest. He'd been called that before. He'd been dismissed, mocked, pitted. But Daniel's tone was different. It was the tone of a man who was about to kill. Ivan Petrov offered me $5 million and a territory in Queens, Daniel continued, to open the door from the inside. The Teterboro attack was just bait to get the boss out of the penthouse. Ethan's breathing grew shallow, but his mind was racing. $5 million. Queens. He's going to kill me. He's going to. You're betraying him, Ethan said, and he hated how small his voice sounded. He hated how scared he was, even though he'd been preparing for this moment for years. Even though his father had trained him, had shown him exactly what to do when the shadows finally caught up with him. I'm securing my retirement, Daniel corrected. He was close now. Ethan could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Ivan doesn't want you dead, sweetheart. Not yet. He wants the ledger your father hid. The master account numbers for the Swiss and Cayman shell corporations. Mateo Hayes was a paranoid man. He wouldn't just destroy it. He left it with you. I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan whimpered, shrinking back against the neck of his cello. I'm just a musician. I've been blind since I was 12. Cut the crap. Daniel spat, reaching out and brutally grabbing a fistful of Ethan's dark curls, yanking his head back. Ethan cried out in pain as the man's grip tightened, pulling his hair so hard his eyes watered. You're going to tell me exactly how to access those accounts, Daniel snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, or I'm going to start breaking those delicate, expensive fingers of yours. One by one, Daniel made his first fatal mistake. He assumed Ethan's blindness equaled helplessness. He assumed the trembling boy in front of him was nothing more than a fragile victim. He didn't know that Mateo Hayes, a man hunted by the most dangerous criminals on the East Coast, had spent his final years preparing his son for the exact moment the shadows finally caught up with him. Please, Ethan sobbed, dropping his cello bow. His hands scrambled blindly across the floor, desperately reaching for his white carbon fiber cane, lying near the chair. I'll tell you whatever you want. That's a good boy, Daniel mocked, loosening his grip on Ethan's hair slightly. His guard was dropping as his arrogance peaked. He'd won. He had the information. He had the money. He had everything. Where is it, Ethan? Ethan's fingers wrapped tightly around the rubber grip of his cane. The ledger isn't a book, he whispered, his voice suddenly devoid of all panic. The trembling stopped. The tears vanished. Daniel frowned, leaning in closer. What did you say? I said, Ethan's voice turned to ice. It's not a book, you pathetic amateur. In a blur of motion so fast Daniel couldn't even process it, Ethan didn't just stand up, he exploded upward. Using his grip on Daniel's forearm as leverage, he twisted his body violently. His left hand snapped up, driving the heel of his palm directly into the nerve cluster under Daniel's jaw with bone-rattling force. Daniel choked, his vision flashing white as his grip on Ethan's hair completely released. Before he could raise his suppressed pistol, Ethan's right hand whipped the carbon fiber cane through the air. His thumb depressed a concealed biometric button on the grip, and with a sharp metallic snick, an 8-inch razor-sharp titanium blade shot out from the tip of the cane. He slashed upward with lethal precision. The blade severed the flexor tendons in Daniel's right wrist. A gurgling scream tore from Daniel's throat as the pistol clattered uselessly to the marble floor. He stumbled back, clutching his heavily bleeding arm in absolute shock. You, he stammered, unable to comprehend that the fragile, blind musician had just surgically dismantled him in 3 seconds. Ethan didn't hesitate. His spatial awareness, honed by 6 years of relying entirely on acoustics and air pressure, was flawless. He stepped forward, sweeping Daniel's legs out from under him with a brutal kick to his knee. Daniel crashed onto his back, gasping in agony. Ethan calmly stepped over him, pressing the tip of his titanium blade directly against Daniel's carotid artery. "My father didn't hide the ledger, Daniel," Ethan said, his tone as cold and commanding as any Mafia don's. "He encoded it. It's hidden in the sheet music of an original concerto he composed for me. I memorized every account number, every routing code, every shell corporation when I was 15 years old." He leaned down, his lips brushing against Daniel's ear, and whispered, "I hold the financial reins of the Volkov and Petrov empires in my head." Daniel stared up at Ethan's blank, unseeing eyes. Absolute terror finally set in. She wasn't a victim. He was a weapon his father had armed and left behind. "I've known Nikolai was watching me for 12 years, Ethan continued, pressing the blade just enough to draw a bead of blood. "I allowed his men to shadow me. I allowed myself to be brought here, because I knew Ivan Petrov would eventually try to finish what he started. And I needed Nikolai's resources to wipe the Petrovs off the map." Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors to the penthouse burst open with the force of an explosion. Nikolai Volkov stormed in, his suit jacket discarded, his dress shirt stained with blood, his P-226 raised and ready to fire. Sergei and 3 guards flooded in behind him, weapons drawn. They'd realized the Teterboro attack was a diversion and had raced back through the city like madmen. Nikolai froze. The breath completely left his lungs. The scene before him defied all logic. His fragile, terrified Ethan, the boy he protected for 12 years, the boy he'd given everything to keep safe, was standing over his top captain. A bloodied titanium blade was pressed to the traitor's throat. Ethan's posture was flawless, radiating a lethal, cold authority that commanded the room. "Ethan Vasquez," Nikolai whispered, lowering his weapon an inch. His mind struggled to process the dominant predator standing in his living room. Ethan didn't turn his head. "He sold you out to Ivan Petrov for $5 million and a slice of Queens. He came for the ledger." Sergei looked at the bleeding, terrified Daniel, then at the blind cellist. His jaw practically hit the floor. "Boss," he completely neutralized him. Nikolai's shock slowly melted into something far more dangerous. A dark, magnificent smirk spread across his face. The obsession he had held for the innocent boy morphed instantly into a profound, terrifying awe for the king standing before him. "Sergei," Nikolai ordered, his voice vibrating with lethal pride, "take Daniel to the soundproof room in the basement. He gets to live until he tells us exactly where Ivan Petrov is sleeping tonight. Then he doesn't." "Yes, boss." Sergei roughly hauled the weeping traitor off the floor and dragged him out of the room. The doors clicked shut, leaving Nikolai and Ethan alone in the shattered luxury of the penthouse. Nikolai holstered his weapon and slowly walked toward Ethan. The younger man pressed a button on his cane, the blade retracting seamlessly back into the shaft. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, but his face was calm, serene, even. Nikolai stopped inches from him. The scent of gunpowder and rain radiated from his clothes. He reached out, his blood-stained hands gently framing Ethan's face. "You played me," Nikolai murmured, his thumb tracing the scar on Ethan's jawline. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, reverent fascination. "For 12 years, I thought I was the guardian angel protecting a helpless boy in the dark." "I was never helpless, Nikolai," Ethan replied, leaning into his touch. A dangerous smile finally broke across his lips. "You just prefer the illusion. My father was the smartest man in your syndicate. Did you really think he would leave me defenseless?" Nikolai laughed, low and dark. The sound vibrated through Ethan's chest, sending shivers down his spine. "No, I don't think he would." His thumb traced the line of Ethan's jaw, gentle and possessive. "I've watched you for 12 years, Ethan. Every performance, every scholarship ceremony, every doctor's appointment. I thought I knew everything about you. You knew what I wanted you to know," Ethan said, and there was no shame in his voice. "You knew the boy who needed protection. The boy who was fragile and scared. You didn't know the boy who spent every night memorizing account numbers and learning how to kill." Nikolai's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something else, something primal and desperate. "You're magnificent," he breathed. "You're absolutely magnificent." He leaned down, his forehead resting against Ethan's. Their breath mingled in the space between them, hot and urgent. Ethan could feel the rapid beat of Nikolai's heart through the man's shirt, could smell the blood and sweat and gunpowder, and underneath it all the jasmine. The ghost of his mother, the scent that had always meant home. "I've wanted you for so long," Nikolai confessed, his voice breaking on the words. "Not just the boy I protected. Not just the innocent. You. All of you. The fire, the steel, the darkness you've been hiding." Ethan's hand slid up to grip Nikolai's lapels, blood-stained silk, warm and smooth beneath his fingers. "You wanted a victim," he whispered. "You got a partner." A low, possessive growl rumbled in Nikolai's chest. He pressed his lips to Ethan's, hard and fierce and desperate, a kiss that tasted of whiskey and blood and 12 years of obsessive longing. It was the kind of kiss that claimed, the kind that demanded, the kind that promised violence and devotion in equal measure. Ethan kissed him back. He met Nikolai's intensity with his own, pushing up onto his toes, wrapping his arms around the older man's neck. He could feel the scars beneath the silk, the evidence of a life lived on the edge of violence. He could feel the tremble in Nikolai's hands, the barely restrained hunger that had been building for more than a decade. They broke apart, gasping for air. "Ivan Petrov dies tonight," Nikolai said, his voice rough and urgent. "Every warehouse, every safe house, every remaining soldier with his blood in their veins. It will burn before the sun comes up." "I know," Ethan whispered, his fingers tangling in Nikolai's hair. "And when the ashes settle, Nikolai, we will rebuild this empire together." Nikolai's hand found Ethan's chin, tilting his face up. He pressed another kiss to his lips, softer this time, sweeter, a promise rather than a demand. "You'll stay by my side," he murmured against Ethan's mouth. "At every meeting, every negotiation, every execution. You'll be there, holding my hand, whispering the numbers in my ear. You'll be my heart, Ethan. My conscience. Your king," Ethan offered, and there was a smirk in his voice. "My everything," Nikolai corrected, and the raw honesty in his voice made Ethan's heart ache. They stayed there for a long moment, forehead to forehead, breathing each other in. The penthouse was silent except for the distant wail of sirens, the sound of a city that had no idea its foundations were about to shift. Then Nikolai pulled back, his grip on Ethan's hand tightening. "Come on. We have a war to win." Ethan smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile that Nikolai couldn't see, but could feel in the way Ethan's fingers tightened around his. "Lead the way, Don Volkov." The war lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of blood and fire and whispers in the dark. 3 weeks of Ethan sitting beside Nikolai in boardrooms and safe houses, his cane across his knees, his lips pressed close to Nikolai's ear as he recited account numbers and routing codes, and the names of men who were about to die. He was Nikolai's shadow, his lieutenant, his heart. Men who had once dismissed him. The blind boy, the cellist, the burden, learned to fear him. They saw the way Nikolai listened to him, the way the Don's hand would find Ethan's thigh under the table, the way Ethan would tilt his head and smile, and a man's fate would be sealed. The Petrov family crumbled. Ivan Petrov was found in a safe house in the Hamptons, hiding like the coward he was. Sergei had dragged him out by the hair and thrown him at Nikolai's feet. The man had wept, begged, promised anything, just like the traitor in the penthouse weeks ago. Nikolai had looked down at him, then at Ethan, who was standing at his side with his cane in hand and that terrifying serene smile on his face. "He's yours," Nikolai had said. "Do what you want with him." Ethan had leaned down, his lips brushing against Ivan's ear. "You killed my father," he'd whispered. "You took my sight. You took everything." He pressed the blade of his cane against Ivan's throat, just enough to draw blood, just enough to make the man scream. And then he'd step back. "No," he'd said, and Nikolai had felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt. "I'm not going to kill you. That's too easy. I'm going to let you rot in a black site for the rest of your miserable life." And when you're old and broken and forgotten, you'll remember this moment. The blind boy you dismissed. The blind boy who destroyed everything you loved. Ivan Petrov had been dragged away, screaming, and Ethan had turned to Nikolai with that sharp, beautiful smile. Not bad for a musician, huh? 3 months later. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue had become home. Ethan sat at the grand piano, a Steinway that Nikolai had ordered in just for him, his fingers dancing across the keys. He was composing again, a new concerto, something that blended the darkness of the past few months with the warmth of the life he was building. Nikolai was in the corner, as always, watching him with that intense, possessive gaze. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 25 and was nursing it slowly, savoring the sight of his lover lost in the music. They'd been through so much together. The war, the blood, the secrets. But now, in the quiet of the penthouse, with the city glittering far below, it felt like they'd finally found peace. Nikolai set down his glass and crossed the room. Ethan felt him approach, the shift in air pressure, the familiar warmth of his presence. He didn't stop playing, but his lips curved into a smile. Yes. Nikolai wrapped his arms around Ethan from behind, his chest pressed against Ethan's back, his lips brushing against the shell of Ethan's ear. You're playing my favorite. I know, Ethan said, and there was a teasing lilt in his voice. I play it every time I want something. Nikolai laughed, low, warm, genuine. What do you want, Moil Yubop? Ethan spun on the piano bench, wrapping his arms around Nikolai's neck. His unseeing eyes found the older man's face by memory, by the warmth of his skin, by the beat of his heart. You, he whispered. Always you. Nikolai kissed him, deep and slow, and full of promises. It was the kiss of a man who had waited 12 years for the boy who would become his everything. The kiss of a monster who had found his heart in the darkness. When they broke apart, Ethan was laughing. What? Nikolai asked, his forehead against Ethan's. Nothing, Ethan said, and there was a light in his face that had nothing to do with sight. I'm just thinking. My mother always told me I'd find someone who'd see me for who I really am. She never said it would be a Mafia don. Nikolai snorted. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Ethan said softly. And I think. He paused, his fingers tracing Nikolai's jaw. I think she'd like you. You're terrifying and possessive, and you've killed more men than I can count. But you love me. You love me so much it's a little bit insane. Nikolai's voice dropped to a growl. More than insane. More than anything. You're mine, Ethan. You've always been mine. Ethan smiled, leaning into the embrace. I know. And you're mine. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the music of the piano still echoing through the penthouse. The city hummed below them, oblivious to the power that lived in this building, oblivious to the love that had been forged in blood and fire. Ethan pulled back, a mischievous smile on his face. Now, he said, are you going to help me finish this concerto? Or are you just going to stand there looking pretty? Nikolai laughed, a sound that would have made his enemies weep, and pressed another kiss to Ethan's forehead. I can do both. New York City didn't know it yet, but the Mafia hierarchy had just violently shifted. The untouchable Don Volkov had finally met his match. And the most dangerous person in the criminal underworld was the one nobody saw coming. A blind cellist with a father's legacy, a lover's devotion, and the soul of a king. And as the sun rose over the skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan Vasquez sat at his piano and played the first notes of a new world. Nikolai watched him, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. I love you, he whispered, and Ethan's smile, that sharp, dangerous, beautiful smile, was the only answer he needed. Extra story? Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue, a relentless percussion that had become the soundtrack of Ethan Vasquez's new life. 3 months had passed since the night he'd stumbled into Nikolai Volkov's world, and into the man himself. 3 months of blood and fire and secrets unraveling. 3 months of learning that the monster who had watched him from the shadows was actually the only man who had ever truly seen him. Tonight, though, the rain felt different. Heavier. More threatening. Ethan sat on the edge of the massive bed in Nikolai's private quarters, their private quarters now. Though the transition had happened so gradually, he wasn't sure when it had become official. His bare feet pressed into the cool silk of the sheets, and his fingers traced the intricate embroidery on the duvet cover. Everything in this room smelled like Nikolai, expensive oud wood, gun oil, and underneath it all, that faint ghost of jasmine that always made Ethan's chest ache with something too complicated to name. His cane was propped against the nightstand, the titanium blade retracted and dormant. He didn't need it in here. He'd memorized every inch of this penthouse, every corner, every piece of furniture, every shift in air pressure that told him where the walls were. This was his territory now, as much as it was Nikolai's. But tonight something was wrong. Ethan could feel it in the way the air in the room had gone still, in the way his skin prickled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He tilted his head, his unseeing hazel eyes scanning the darkness that was his constant companion. "Nikolai," he called out, his voice soft but carrying an edge of urgency. No response. Ethan rose from the bed, his bare feet silent against the marble floor. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who had learned to navigate a world of shadows through sound alone, his head slightly cocked, his breathing slow and measured, his entire body a finely tuned instrument of perception. The penthouse was too quiet. The usual hum of the sub-zero refrigerator was absent. The distant whistle of wind against the reinforced glass was there, but it was muffled, as though the storm were pressing its ear against the building and listening. He's not here, Ethan realized, and the thought sent a spike of cold through his chest. Nikolai never left without telling him. Never. Not after the betrayal, not after the war. They'd made a pact, no more secrets, no more disappearances. Ethan's fingers found the wall, tracing it as he moved through the suite. He passed the grand piano, his fingers brushing the cold ivory keys for just a moment. He passed the couch where Nikolai spent hours watching him play. He passed the bar where Nikolai poured them both whiskey at midnight, his thumb always lingering on Ethan's hand. And then he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the rain. A sharp metallic click. The door to the private elevator, the one that required biometric clearance, the one that was supposed to be impenetrable. Someone was coming up. Ethan's heart rate spiked, but his breathing remained steady. He'd learned that lesson from his father 12 years ago. In the wreckage of that car, panic kills. Calm saves. He took 2 steps back, his hand finding the familiar weight of his cane. His thumb pressed the biometric button, and he felt the subtle vibration of the titanium blade extending into the shaft. He didn't brandish it. He held it at his side, the tip pointing down, his posture relaxed. Let them think he was unarmed. Let them think he was helpless. That was always their first mistake. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper that was almost inaudible. Ethan heard the footsteps immediately. 3 sets, no 4. Heavy. Deliberate. Men who were used to being feared. They stepped into the penthouse with the swagger of predators, and Ethan could smell them from across the room. Cheap cologne, stale cigarette smoke, and something else, something metallic and sharp that made his stomach turn. Blood. Fresh blood. Ethan Vasquez. The voice was deep, accented, dripping with contempt. A voice that didn't belong to any of Nikolai's men. I've heard so much about you. The blind boy who brought the Volkov Empire to its knees. Ethan tilted his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. I'm flattered, he said, his tone light, almost amused. Though I should warn you, I'm not as easy to kill as I look. The man laughed, harsh, grating sound that echoed off the marble walls. You think you're clever? You think you can talk your way out of this? Nikolai Volkov is dead, boy. We took care of him tonight. He died screaming, begging for his life, begging for you. Something cold and terrible bloomed in Ethan's chest. A denial, a refusal, white-hot fury that had nothing to do with logic. But he didn't let it show on his face. His expression remained serene, almost bored. "You're lying," he said calmly. "Nikolai doesn't scream. He makes other people scream. It's one of the things I find most attractive about him." The man faltered for just a second, thrown off by the casual, almost flirtatious tone. That second was all Ethan needed. He moved. His cane whipped through the air in a blur of carbon fiber and steel. The titanium blade caught the man across the face, a diagonal slash that opened his cheek to the bone. The man screamed, stumbling backward, his hand flying to his ruined face. "Get him!" someone shouted from behind him. Ethan dropped into a low crouch, his ears tracking the movement. Footsteps to his left, heavy, uncoordinated. Footsteps to his right, lighter, more careful. 2 of them. He lunged to the left, the blade slicing through the air in a wide arc. The sound of flesh parting, the sickening crunch of bone, and another body hit the floor. He pivoted, spinning on his heel, using the momentum to bring the cane up and under the second attacker's ribs. The titanium blade punched through fabric and muscle with a wet, tearing sound. The man gasped, his weight collapsing forward. Ethan stepped aside, letting him fall past him, and brought the blade down across the back of his neck. 3 down. The 4th attacker had stopped moving. Ethan could hear his breathing, ragged, panicked, the breathing of a man who had just realized he was in a cage with a predator he'd underestimated. "Please," the man started. "Please what?" Ethan asked, his voice utterly cold. "Please let you go. Please spare your life." He stepped closer, the tip of his blade trailing across the marble floor. "Tell me what happened to Nikolai. Tell me the truth, and I might let you walk out of here with all your limbs intact." He wasn't at the warehouse," the man stammered. "We were supposed to ambush him. We were told you'd be alone. Please, I'm just a soldier." "I didn't." "You didn't what?" Ethan's voice was soft, almost gentle. "You didn't think I could fight? You didn't think a blind boy could kill 3 trained men in under 30 seconds? No, please." Ethan smiled, a razor-sharp smile that Nikolai would have recognized instantly. A smile that said, "I've won, and you've already lost." "One more question," he said, his blade pressing against the man's throat. "Is Nikolai dead?" "Answer carefully." "My blade is very, very sharp." I don't know. They didn't tell me." He's lying, Ethan thought. He's terrified, but he's lying. He knows something. Ethan pressed the blade just deep enough to draw blood. The man whimpered. "Last chance," Ethan whispered. "Where is he?" Teterboro. They're stripped. They took him to one of the hangars. They were going to make it look like an accident. "Please, I told you everything." "Thank you," Ethan said politely. And then he slashed the man's throat in one clean motion. The man's body crumpled to the floor, and Ethan stepped over it without a second glance. He was already moving toward the elevator, his cane in hand, the blade still dripping. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. Nikolai wasn't dead. They would have bragged about it. They would have brought proof. He was alive, and he was in trouble, and Ethan was going to find him. The elevator ride down to the garage was the longest 90 seconds of his life. He emerged into the underground parking structure, the cold concrete echoing with the distant sound of sirens. The Maybach was there, Nikolai's prized armored sedan, and the driver, an older man named Dmitri, who had always been kind to Ethan, was standing beside it with a worried expression. "Mr. Vasquez," Dmitri started, but Ethan cut him off. "Take me to Teterboro." "No. Don't argue with me." Dmitri hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Vasquez." The drive was brutal, a blur of rain and flashing lights, and the distant roar of thunder. Ethan sat in the back seat, his cane gripped in his white-knuckled hands, his mind running through every possible scenario. They ambushed him. They thought they'd be killing a monster. Instead, they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. He thought about Nikolai's hands on his face, the way the older man's thumb always traced the scar on his jaw. He thought about the way Nikolai whispered Moya Lyubov when he thought Ethan was asleep, the way his voice broke on the words. He thought about the way Nikolai had looked at him that night in the penthouse, when the blood was still drying on his hands and he'd said, "You're magnificent." He's not dead. He can't be dead. I'd feel it. I know it. He couldn't explain that certainty. The way the bond between them had become something almost supernatural, a tie that existed beyond sight or reason. It was obsessive and reckless and probably unhealthy, and Ethan didn't care. He's mine, Ethan thought, and the possessiveness of the thought startled him. He's mine, and I'm not letting anyone take him from me. The hangar at Teterboro was a cavernous space of corrugated metal and dripping water. Ethan could hear it from the moment the car doors opened, the massive empty echo, the way the rain sounded different against the metal roof, the way the voices that filtered through the walls were muffled and strained. "I need a weapon," Ethan said to Dmitri. The driver hesitated again, then reached into the glove compartment and handed Ethan a compact Sig Sauer P365. "It's loaded," Dmitri said. "Safety's on." "I know how to use it," Ethan said, and it wasn't a lie. His father had taught him to shoot before he'd lost his sight, and after he trained in a soundproof shooting range, learning to aim by the echo of the gunfire, by the way the sound bounced off the paper targets. He pocketed the pistol and walked toward the hangar. The main door was unlocked. Of course it was. These were men who thought they'd already won. Their mistake. Ethan slipped inside, his body moving with the ghost-like grace that blindness had forced upon him. The smells hit him immediately. Jet fuel, oil, concrete dust, and beneath it all, the distinct, unmistakable scent of blood. Nikolai's blood. Something inside Ethan's chest cracked. A dam broke. A gate opened. He forced the fury down, locked it away behind walls of ice. He heard voices up ahead. 3 of them, maybe 4. They were arguing about something about payment, about who had botched the job. Ethan's ears focused, filtering out the noise, tracking their positions. And then he heard it. Nikolai's voice. "Going to enjoy watching you try." It was weak, strained, but unmistakable. The same gravelly baritone that had whispered "mine" in Ethan's ear 3 months ago. The same voice that had promised to protect him, to keep him safe, to love him until the end of time. Ethan moved. He followed the sound of Nikolai's voice, his cane silent against the concrete floor. The blade was already extended, the pistol was in his other hand, and his entire body was a coiled spring of lethal potential. He found them near the back of the hangar, a small knot of men surrounding a figure who was kneeling on the ground. Even through the dim lighting, Ethan could hear the wet, rasping quality of Nikolai's breathing. Broken ribs, maybe. Internal bleeding. The sound of a man who was still fighting, but only barely. "Step away from him," Ethan said. His voice sliced through the hangar like a knife, clean and cold and utterly devoid of fear. The men spun around. Ethan heard the click of weapons being drawn, 3 guns, maybe 4. He counted them in his head, the sharp metallic sound of slides being racked, the slight variation in the echo that told him where each man was positioned. Who the hell? One of them started. Ethan didn't let him finish. He raised the Sig Sauer and fired twice, the recoil familiar and welcome. 2 bodies hit the ground. He dropped into a roll, the carbon fiber cane sweeping the legs out from under a 3rd man, and the titanium blade found his throat before he could scream. The 4th man was backing away, his footsteps frantic and unsteady. "Stay back. Stay back, you freak." Ethan stood up, his blade pointing toward the sound of the man's voice. "You've got 2 options," he said, his tone conversational, almost bored. "You can run. I'll let you live for now because I have more important things to deal with. Or you can stay, and I'll show you exactly what I did to your friends." The man ran. Ethan didn't bother chasing him. He was already moving toward Nikolai, dropping to his knees beside the older man, his hands finding Nikolai's face with desperate accuracy. "Nikolai." I'm fine, Nikolai rasped, but even he didn't sound convinced. I should have known it was a setup. They brought you up. That's what broke me. They said they were going to. I know what they said. Ethan cut him off, his voice gentle but firm. It wasn't true. They're dead. I killed them. Nikolai laughed, a weak, blood-spattered sound that was more relief than amusement. Of course you did. Of course. He reached up, his blood-stained hand cupping Ethan's cheek. You came for me. You. I'll always come for you, Ethan said, and his voice broke on the last word. Always, Nikolai. I'm not losing you. Not now. Not ever. He pressed his forehead to Nikolai's, their breath mingling in the cold air of the hangar. The rain had stopped outside, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost sacred. You're magnificent, Nikolai whispered, echoing his words from that night 3 months ago. You're absolutely magnificent. Ethan smiled, that sharp, dangerous, beautiful smile that had made Nikolai fall in love with him all over again. I know, he said. Now let's get you out of here. I got a bottle of Macallan 25 waiting at home, and I believe you still owe me a dance. They made it back to the penthouse as dawn was breaking over the city. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale pink and gold, and Ethan helped Nikolai into the shower, carefully washing the blood from his skin. Nikolai watched him the entire time, watched him with those gray-blue eyes that had seen so much death and destruction, and yet, when they looked at Ethan, they held nothing but light. You're mine, Nikolai murmured, his lips brushing against Ethan's wet hair. You've always been mine. Ethan tilted his head up, meeting the older man's gaze with his unseeing eyes. And you're mine, he said. Everything you are, everything you have, it's mine. Every part of you. Even the parts that scare you. Especially those parts. Nikolai's arms wrapped around him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. I love you, he said, and the words were so raw, so honest, that it made Ethan's chest ache. I love you so much it terrifies me. You're the only thing that's ever made me feel human. The only thing that's ever made me feel like I deserve to live. Ethan pulled back, his hands cupping Nikolai's face. Then stay alive, he whispered. Stay alive for me. That's all I ask. Just stay alive. Nikolai kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of salt and blood and something so sweet it made Ethan's knees weak. A kiss that said more than words ever could. Forever, Nikolai murmured against his lips. I promise. Forever. And in the golden light of the morning, wrapped in each other's arms, they made a new vow, a vow that had nothing to do with vengeance or empires or blood. A vow that was only about this, two broken men, two monsters, two lovers who had found each other in the darkness, and who would never let go. Then,